But thank you for joining us. I'm Rodney Dawson, Curator of Education at the Greensboro History Museum. Today's conversation is made possible in part by the Greensboro History Museum, Inc., the City of Greensboro, as well as the Libraries Department. And so any views, findings, or recommendations expressed in today's program do not necessarily reflect those aforementioned entities. And we're extremely pleased to have you as our guest audience tonight. If you'll take the time to look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see that Q/A, that Q&A icon. By selecting this option, we can field questions for our panelists. You'll just type that in and then hit enter. That will submit your question. We are reserving the latter part of the program, the last 10 minutes, to field questions in general, but knowing Dr. Jones, she might switch it up and take questions at any time. So just feel free to put them in there, especially if you think you may forget it later. This will also be made available as an archive. Normally it's immediate. However, when we finish tonight, wait till after 5:30 tomorrow, and it could even be a little before that, and you'll be able to retrieve it. Just go to our Greensboro History YouTube channel, or you can go to our website, greensborohistory.org, go to look at the top, and you'll see the YouTube icon, and select that, and it'll take you to all the webinars we've done. You can catch the previous two, including the one tonight. And we are now being joined by another panelist, so that's great. But tonight we're talking about from the Grassroots to Government series, the Ad Hoc Committee on African American Disparities. So I'm really interested. And I know that we're gonna have an outstanding panel and a great moderator. She's been with us before, Director of the Human Rights Department for the City of Greensboro, none other than Dr. Love Jones. Dr. Love Jones, I'll leave it in your competent hands.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you so much, Rodney. Again, it's wonderful to be before you again this Tuesday, focusing on the Ad Hoc Committee for African American Disparity. Again, Grassroots to Government is a series that is really diving deeply into the development of a relationship between volunteers in our community who have taken time out to address issues of human rights, and doing so in ways that are focused and consistent and diligent on behalf of the community. Tonight, we are looking more closely at the development of a newer body, again, the Ad Hoc Committee for African American Disparity. And we have with us Crystal Black and Josie Williams. Josie Williams is the executive director of the Greensboro Housing Coalition and has been integral in the development of the Ad Hoc Committee for African American Disparity, or ACAD. Crystal Black has been definitely a force to be reckoned with when it comes to not only the development of ACAD, but several other advocacy efforts in the community, also known as the Shoe Lady. And we'll talk more about that as we get into a deeper conversation. Crystal is with Communities in Schools and is based at Rankin Elementary. And she has devoted her time, energy, and efforts to the development of ACAD as well. The first thing that I would like to do is, of course, welcome both of you to tonight's segment, and thank you both for being willing to have a conversation about not only how ACAD came to be, but also some of the anticipated outcomes, what the community can expect as far as what ACAD may very well accomplish. But I think it's important, very important, to first understand how any organized body that is a volunteer body comes to be on behalf of city government. So I want to give just a snippet explanation for those in the audience who may not know how that works. Whether it's a longstanding body that you're familiar with, like the Human Rights Commission or the Zoning Commission or the Commission for the Status of Women, ultimately, many of these bodies begin as some sort of committee or task force, definitely with a long-standing history of development. We have some boards and bodies that have been in existence for well over 50 years. But ultimately, they begin as a conversation with a group of concerned residents as well as government leaders who want to learn more about why a topic is so critical and to receive critical input from the residents of a community. And so there are some particular steps that one engages in before a body becomes a board or a commission formally and permanently. And ACAD is a fine example of how some of those steps unfold. Usually it begins as a conversation among residents that then evolves into a conversation with city leadership, to include city council and/or city management. And then once it is established that indeed the city will support some of the work that is happening at that community level, a formal committee or a formal task force is developed, at which time there's a window of time where they do the work. And in that window, that substantiates how important it is for that body to remain permanent. So it's important to note that the Ad Hoc Committee for African American Disparity, while in this form, it is an evolving and developing committee, the anticipation is that it will evolve into a permanent body that is supported by our local city government. And so with that being said, I first want to speak to the notion of how ACAD even came into existence, how it even became so much as a thought that the city government needed to support efforts focused on African American populations. So Crystal, if you could share with me some of your initial thoughts and what drove the initial development of ACAD.
Well, I think initially you kind of described it well by the tiers that you led us through. And it started with just some basic communication between local citizens, kind of being in tune to what the environment was at the time. There were a lot of protests going on, a lot of people that were articulating some of their particular wants and needs from the city that they lived in, not just in specifically to Greensboro, but it was happening nationally. And so I started to do some research on former committees that actually had kind of the same premise, and wanted to look and see what happened to those committees. What did they not do, and how did they not move forward? Because I think that we would have solutions in those cities. And so not being able to have knowledge in all areas, you start to reach out to people who can provide different aspects of the different areas of disparities among African Americans. And so that's kind of how it generated into a smaller group that just kind of had some Zoom discussions. We were already quarantined, so that kind of helped us to be able to get together and just have some honest discussions about what we thought could happen. What were some logical and tangible things that we could reach for initially, and what are some things that, and how could we develop to get greater things out of the city that we live in? And so once we got together and started meeting and having those conversations, it kind of came into fruition that we should have a commission. And instead of kind of having a pattern of former commissions, which kind of resulted in recommendations, I would rather this committee be the recommendations so that the commission can follow through with actual actions. And so that was the initial conversation that we brought to the table with the city, and Josie and I were in small groups having those conversations, and it seemed to be welcomed and received well. And we've just been kind of formulating things as we go along to make sure that it's a solid commission and not just something that's kind of thrown together in the moment. So that's kind of the steps that we've taken there. And Love, you've kind of taken it from there with the Human Rights Committee. I mean, the Human Rights being able to come in and kind of lead the way with how we should be able to take on this task.
Thank you, Crystal. I also want to hear from Josie. Josie, at the baseline of we need to do something, and perhaps this could be the development of ACAD. What was your motivation or your thought process about why it was important to have a body focused on the needs of African American populations specifically?
First, in my opinion, it didn't exist. And so it was very exciting for me to see this development. And when I first got the first email, um, and saw Crystal's participation and others, um, and just for the fact during this time when we need it the most. That's what drew me to it, because of everything that you described that it is, the intentional development behind it to make sure that various and diverse voices are heard, and that those voices are straight from the community, from people who live in the areas that we um, know are impacted the most or hardest hit when something like this pandemic is going on. I mean, it's no secret people of color and low income communities are hit the hardest. And so to be able to see this development at that time that had a focus on different areas that has to do with social determinants of health, I was immediately sign me up. And, of course, particularly when it comes to housing, we see the racial disparity when it comes to housing. We see the need and the crisis of that the lack of affordable housing presents. And so when you have these compounding issues on top, and on top of that, you add this pandemic on top of all the things that was going on in housing prior to that. To have this type of body come together in a grassroots effort that rises up out of the community, I just thought it was beautifully exciting. And it was, to me, it was just the perfect time for such a time as this. And so I'm always willing to support anything like that, and help do whatever I can to be on board with that.
Thank you, Josie. The You've actually kind of gotten the ball rolling with, what is the focus of ACAD? What are some of the focus areas, some of the trends that you see emerging? And I'm going to ask you to couple that conversation a little bit with why just for African Americans? At the end of the day, it's very clear that ACAD is focused on the notion of disparity, but that disparity is focused specifically on Black people in Greensboro. Some might say that, there are a lot of needs across the community, and they're not just at the helm of Black doorsteps. Why ACAD? Why the particular trends that you see, and why couched in the dynamic of Black presence in Greensboro?
Crystal, you want to go on that one? And then I'll go.
Well, I think that we're the most impacted. And, I think we have to start with what demographic is the most impacted. And, I had a conversation with somebody one time in the beginning when, I was torn between Black and brown. Mm-hmm. And I was told, if you solve Black problems, you solve brown problems. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of stuck with that and said that, that is kind of true, because we share a lot of the same disparities. We're just at a heightened level of that. And so I also tend to think that we get wrapped into the diversity term, mm-hmm. and we never get our own piece. And so this was critical that we didn't get wrapped into any other forms of diversity, and because it broadens the conversation. And we need this to be narrowed. And I wanted solutions for me, as a Black person, and for people that look like me in my community. So that's really, the reason why I think that having the targeting or specifically looking at the Black community makes it important, because I'm not sure if we ever have that opportunity, so can we have that opportunity is really what I would like to see.
Yeah, I agree. I agree 100%. And I was just, when you said that, the first thing I thought of was data that I see day in and day out when it comes to the environment that we're in. And so I'll paint a picture of what I see. So in Greensboro, in the funding opportunities that have been afforded to the Greensboro Housing Coalition and other agencies, but I only speak to the GHC. I can tell you out of 2,000 applications that I've seen come across in the new rental utility assistance program, well over half of those are in low income Black and brown communities. That's not a coincidence. And then when you layer on compounding issues that are deeply rooted in historical factors, systemic historical factors such as redlining, and when you layer that on to areas that have the most substandard housing, and you layer that on to the areas that have the least accessibility to healthcare, you begin to see a common thread, and that common thread intersects across those Black and brown communities. And we see that right across the nation. And so when we have something that has a focus on African American communities to create the changes that we all want to see, those equitable and equal right changes, that is needed, because in order for us to uproot or change these things that have a systemic structure, you have to focus solely on it. And it's not that we're picking one group just because. It's because not only does our qualitative data show that, our quantitative data shows that. So, and we see that from city to city to city. And if we don't have something like this, that's really coming from a grassroots perspective, and that city council is on board with, our human relations is on board with, I always said the anointing, the leadership, that flows from the head down. So when you got your city council members and your human relations people on board with something, impossible things can come out of that. And when you back a community and you put them at the forefront of an ad hoc committee like this, it gets me excited. And so it's absolutely needed. And I will let anyone know, because we don't have it. We have to get it. It must exist. And so I get very excited about it, as you can tell. And I will tell anybody that. So, the data shows it. So, TV shows it.
Well, you mentioned data, and I think what's important as far as those who are viewing is to understand the term similarly situated. The thing about the thing about looking at data is that the comparison is only appropriate if people are similarly situated, meaning that all other factors are accounted for as the same, with the exception of one thing. And so there are several types of trainings and discussions out there about the data for African American populations. I know that this group navigated the groundwater training sponsored by REI that talks about being similarly situated. And so what that means is that, let's say you're looking at the outcomes for college graduates as it relates to job placement and financial security. In the event that you take people across every ethnicity and you give them the same job and you give them the same salary and you put them in the same locale with the same amount of support on staff, and you give the same cost of living, equitable or comparable housing placement, but then you look at the distribution of student loans, and overwhelmingly Black and or brown populations have the highest debt to income ratio attached to student loans per capita, then that is then what creates the unique situation. Everything else is similarly situated, with the exception of. And so in the research that Josie Williams is referring to, and in the larger realm of disparity that Crystal is talking about, it is because when you situate African American populations against all other ethnicities and similarly situate all of the other factors, there is usually still a disparate factor, something statistically that sets Black people apart by way of barriers, economically, academically, et cetera. And so what I hear you both saying is that with the reality that there's a uniqueness to the barriers for African Americans, that is what merits a focus on African American disparities specifically. Is that fair to say?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Well, let's talk a little bit about those areas of focus. What are those areas of focus that have garnered the attention of ACAD to this point? What are some of the things that you anticipate looking at more closely? Josie, I heard you mention housing. What are some other areas of interest?
We've got education. We've got police and law enforcement. We have economic development. Who else we got? Housing.
Mm-hmm.
That's the 5. Is that 5?
Well, and now I understand that workforce development is going to
That's
become
right.
your 5th area of focus.
And that was out of recommendation for from some of the committee members. So we have taken those recommendations and we want it to be community focused. So as we move along, we will be, taking in that information and making adjustments as we need to. So the committee felt that workforce deserved its own category. And so we have shifted to start to develop that.
Can you, I'm sure Josie's coming back, technology
Yeah.
sometimes is your friend.
Yeah, and my internet has been,
Yes.
The internet
So,
is shaky.
So we know that tech can be spotty, but I know that that certainly Crystal's going to join us as soon as, Josie's going to join us as soon as possible. But in the meantime, Crystal, can you speak to the importance of the support of city leadership when trying to develop something like this? My understanding is that your first conversations were with the individual who is now serving as the liaison for ACAD, and that is Councilwoman Hightower.
Yeah, so Councilwoman Hightower came on board early in the conversation with us and kind of helped us guide this into fruition. And she has been, she's been with us through this in conversation and leadership. So I can't say that we wouldn't be here without her, and having her commit to be a liaison during this process also shows her commitment to it as well. So we know her in the community as being a fighter for disparities already, which is why I reached out to her and asked her to assist with just putting my ideas around this. And she welcomed it, and we, talked around it, and she gave suggestions of things that maybe I shouldn't think about and things I should think about. So her guidance has been very significant in this process, and having her support, she has also gained the support of council members. When I brought it, I remember when I brought it to council, everyone thought that it was a great idea and approved it, which, warmed my heart because it meant something to this community. And at that time, I think that our community needed to know that our council supported them. So it was really good to have that support. And the mayor has also been supportive. So, as far as the city government, and of course your office has been more than supportive, but it has been nothing but wonderful to know that in this process, there has been no resistance. There has been nothing but open arms from the city in all areas in making this happen and getting us to push forward with this idea.
Thank you for that. I think it's important for the community to understand what that network of people consists of when you're talking about getting it from an idea to a full-blown committee. And you did point out something really important, which is that the development of a committee even is still at the helm of council approval. It isn't just one or two leaders that support it and then it gets to unfold. It has to be brought before council as something that the city will back in entirety. And you are right, there was a unanimous consensus about, the support of the ad hoc committee for African American disparity. One of the things that I do want to ask you about, because I think that many times people assume that a person who, and great, we have Josie back with us. Many people sometimes assume that these kinds of ideas are simply like the flavor of the week or the flavor of the month. And truly, when you have people who are vested in the community, the key is to see its course and for it to go the long haul. So can both of you speak to why you're so vested and how important it is to you to see this evolve into a permanent body?
I think,
I'll let Josie go.
for one, this is not a trend that we're in. Trends come and go, right? This is something that the disparities have existed historically over decades and decades, and I don't think that those are going to end anytime soon. But what we can do is use our collective power to join together to begin to, create those changes. I think that you know, people that join have a vision for that type of change that we've been discussing on this call. And I know for myself, that's the type of vision that I have. I do think it's possible for us to see long-term sustainable changes within those focus areas of the ad hoc committee. It's not saying that it will be, it's not saying that it's not going to be challenging. It's not going to be easy, but it's definitely worth the investment of staying in it. And we have to have leaders like ourselves and leaders like these community members that have joined. We have to have that in order for it to sustain itself, in order for us to keep inspiring others to participate with us for the changes that we want to see. And so just seeing that and having the opportunity to be a part of that, that's motivating in itself for me and makes me want to join with others and stay in it for the long haul. Because I do think the change that we're seeking can't happen if we stay united on the same vision, same goals and objectives to create those changes.
Thank you.
Well, I think for me, I don't usually start something I don't finish. So it's kind of hard for me to start something and then walk away. So that is my first commitment. And then it's just something that needs to happen. And so, if it were 2, 10, or 100, however many people are at the table, it's still something that just needs to happen. So I'm willing to commit my time. And I really genuinely think that the people that are involved are wanting a change. And so, what I hear when we're meeting and the feedback that we get, that everybody is really committed to long haul of this. And we've explained it so they know coming in that this is not going to be easy work and it's not going to be quick work. And so they have dedicated that. And so I think that we're all on the same page with what needs to be done. And we still welcome people from the community to give input. And we're open arms still, but there's a core group that's committed to see this through. And that's very important to me.
So I think that one thing that the community hears in this conversation is that there is that commitment, there is that diligence, but it's also important to note that this isn't the first day on the job for you all as, being vested in community work. And so, Crystal, you are known as the shoe lady, and that comes from work that you did for another effort, another cause on behalf of our city when turmoil and disparity directly impacted, communities that were at and below the poverty line, especially, but truthfully, it impacted several people on the east side when the tornado took place. Can you talk a little bit about your work there?
Well, so when the tornado hit in 2018, I personally was not impacted and really was not aware of the tornado and what happened until the next morning. I was just led to go to the east side of Greensboro and figure out what I could do. I didn't know what I could do. And somehow that rolled into a 4-month commitment of helping residents in East Greensboro to recover from that devastation. And, I was honored to give my time to that. And, it was hard time and it was long hours, but it was definitely my honor to do it. And most of the time when I serve the community, it is my honor to do it. And so I work at Rankin Elementary School through Communities in School. And a lot of what I do is trying to bring resources to underserved community and children who have needs and families that have needs. And a lot of times I come into contact with families that, don't have anything. And so I've become more in tune since I've been at Rankin. I've been at some other schools that were just not quite as in despair as the community in that district. And, just started noticing children that would walk down the hall with shoes that were too big, maybe 2 or 3 sizes too big, enough to where you would hear them clunk. Mm-hmm. Or they may be too small and you can tell by the way they're walking too small, or they're torn up. And, one thing that I always had was shoes when I was growing up. And I remember going to Seals. I don't know if you're from Greensboro, but there was a store, Seals in Greensboro, where you went and you got sized and you walked out with your brand new shoes and a balloon. Mm-hmm. And so that was important to me as a kid. So I can imagine missing that moment. And so being able to provide that kid that moment was my goal. And so I started asking people in the community, I need shoes and I don't want used shoes. I want brand new shoes. And so it turned out to be a very overwhelming event, but very successful. And I think at that time, I probably was at maybe about 150 students of providing new shoes to at Rankin. And it was just a very gratifying moment. It caught on because I started through social media and sharing some of the shoes that I had to replace. We don't do kid faces, but I wanted them to see what I see on a daily basis. And sometimes you have to put that on forefront for people to be able to see it and it touched them in a way to make them move. Mm. And so that's what that did. And so it was a good moment, just like helping with the tornado. And I find that anytime you can do those volunteer efforts, I've worked with a lot of people in the city and with the city that has brought a lot of gratification to me personally. And this is just another effort, I think, in the end, that will be another tier of me being able to give back.
Well, I definitely hear empathy driving the ship. You started with the narrative about what it meant for you to have new shoes and the gratification that you felt there as a child and how you knew the importance of that gratification for children and or not necessarily being impacted by the tornado directly, but understanding that when I wake up in the morning and my house is fully intact and there are people who are missing an entire roof, in a certain part of our community, what is it that I can do? So the question of what can I do also drives this ship. Josie, I want to ask you this question, or I want to revisit something you were speaking about. You shared just a glimpse, a snapshot of the disparity when it comes to housing for African-American populations. Here we are at the height of, hopefully on the downward slope of a pandemic, but very much so we're in a very unpredictable space right now. Vaccines are available. Some people are able to take them. Some people are not. Some people are opting not to. The outside, quote unquote, is opening up. And so when you put those two things together, we hope that we're on the downslope of a pandemic, but it's yet to be seen. We're still at a 7% infection rate. And so with that in mind, we've got moratoriums that are, a moratorium that's going to lift very soon regarding eviction protections. In the community, there's talk of some people already exercising evictions despite the moratorium still being in place. So can you talk a little bit about how the housing terrain for African Americans has been impacted by this pandemic and what that means for some potential work of ACAD?
That is such a deep question. I'll say this. Because of everything that we just discussed, we're seeing a disparate impact across communities with a large population of African American families.
Mm-hmm.
We're seeing, because of that, the families that are impacted the most have the most trouble to stabilize that household, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we are seeing folks figuring out how to work the loopholes that exist in the CDC moratorium, which is why you're hearing about some of the evictions still happening. And what I've seen just in the last 7 days, I saw 2 people become homeless because of that, and I saw 3 others. They are at immediate risk of becoming homeless because of that, and they are all African American families. The information that we are trying to do to mitigate that is put a focus and prioritize families that are at a income bracket that if they were evicted, even if they have some income, they are still unstable, even if they were to find new housing tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
That instability going into that new home still exists for that household. And we're seeing most of that across communities of color within our city. And we're seeing an isolation of that, or I guess you could say a concentration of that in East Greensboro and Southeast Greensboro. And so it's sad to see those stories day in and day out. And so what we've been wanting to do is, again, and I just mentioned this in our little group meeting with the ad hoc committee and our individual groups a couple of weeks ago, there are ways that we can come together to advocate on a local level, reaching our state level and our federal level. And there's ways to do that effectively. There's ways to do that, because I know when you're getting nonprofits involved, we have to walk this fine line, because we're not a nonprofit that can, lobby and do all those things. But what we can do is partner with community members. What we can do is work through the ad hoc committee and do some advocacy. And what we can do is bring folks like Human Relations together with North Carolina Legal Aid, so we can educate not only ourselves on what the rights are and what we and what we can and can't do, but we need to do that with the community members as well. And I believe the ad hoc committee is in a unique position right now to help us advocate across not only housing, but the other priorities that the committee has at the table right now. And so, I just mentioned this the other night, I think that if we strategically do that in a way that we are hitting some areas simultaneously, like you can't talk about housing if you don't talk about race. You can't, you know what I mean? You can't talk about food access without talking about race. You can't talk about the issues that we see regarding police enforcement. I mean, we're sitting here now, we just heard the verdict, regarding George Floyd. And you can't have those conversations without talking about race and equity and those things. And so to try to work on the priorities of the ad hoc committee separately from one another, that won't work. And so I like the structure that brings us together as a group to talk about those things together and strategize together. Because looking at what's happening in our housing environment right now, I told someone the other day, I never get too alarmed too quickly. It's not that I don't have a sense of urgency, that I do, but I don't get alarmed quickly and jump the gun on a decision. I can strategize, and I like to implement and plan to do the right course of action, so you have the most effective benefit to the strategy that you implemented. But I told someone, I said, I am concerned because of what what I'm seeing so quickly transpire even over the last few weeks. Mm-hmm. Leases are becoming due. Your leases are up now. So what has happened, folks have figured out these loopholes in the moratorium, and they're working them well, unfortunately. And we're seeing people at risk or getting evicted, or not even evicted, like scared out of their homes. And we're seeing that disproportionately across people of color in the areas that have the most disparate impact, which we know what those are in Greensboro. And that's concerning. And we need collective action to address that and work together to do that. So I think the ad hoc committee is in a unique position. And that's a lot. I tell someone, don't be overwhelmed. That's a lot. But we can break things down and work on strategies to look at some of those issues to see the best course of action to take.
And the connecting piece to that is that we see we have seen influx of kids moving from the schools, and so we have part of what I do is we do a lot of home visits, and we're getting to homes and finding that they're not there anymore. And so that's just that residual effect of how, why can't, we've got to talk about this in all committees and have those subcategories because they're intertwined. They affect or impact each other.
Yes, exactly.
So your conversation, even in this like short snippet, is highly systemic. It's about connecting the dots, about the fact that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and that is indeed, the approach moving forward to address disparity. I want to ask you, do you believe that different generations view problems and solutions differently? And is that important to consider in the approach that ACAD takes? Because ACAD is a relatively diverse body that consists primarily of African Americans, and also there's a lot of age diversity and other intersections of identity. And so when you're talking about that kind of intergenerational work that has to happen to address issues, sometimes there's a different perspective about problems and solutions. Do you think that different generations view it differently, and does that impact ACAD in any sort of way?
I think that it does, and that's what we want. Yeah. We want that variety and the different generational perspectives. I find that I'm kind of in between a lot of times with young and the older generation of some of the thoughts, but I want to embrace all of them. I'm not a know-all, and I don't come to the table presenting myself to know all. And so we have to kind of humble ourselves in all of our areas and be able to have this honest discussion. So I love the way that the makeup of the ACAD is at the moment, because it does offer us that opportunity to be able to have various perspectives. And I'm sure there'll be several that I won't agree with, but that's what we wanted. That is exactly what we wanted.
Absolutely. Yeah, I welcome that. I like to sit at the feet of the elders, and I like to hang out with the young folk, and then I like to sit in between because that's just how I was raised. But I love that because the elders can tell you things historically that there's nowhere you are aware of. And then they can let you know from their perspective what is happening in that generation, in that age group, related to the things that we're talking about, these social drivers, health access and Medicaid and housing and things. It's a different perspective that we need to understand, and you can only get that from those voices. And then you have the young folks, they come in with a whole new, like my daughter say, flavor of ideas and the way to do things. And it's my young folk that can help us promote something like no other. and so we need that. And so we're sitting up there strategizing, and you have young people at the table that gives you a perspective on how to promote something, how to create something, how to implement something in an innovative way. And just to hear not only about creation, but the challenges that young people are facing. And then you have that middle ground. I welcome that. And so that was the other thing that drew me to the ad hoc committee. I was looking for that. I was like, I'm not signing up for that if I don't see the diversity. But I did, and I was like, this is going to be really good. I think that's very powerful. So, and then to Crystal's point, we won't all agree, but that's fine. I mean, we can come to, there's going to be some commonalities. There's going to be some things we won't agree. But I think for overall and for those, I think for overall, everybody wants to see those real changes that we've been fighting for and for so long. I think it's going to be still something very powerful that's going to come out of it.
Thank you both. As a kind of, as we get down to the final part of the hour, especially where Q&A will become available to the general public, I want to highlight that your first formal monthly meeting is going to take place on this Thursday at 6 p.m. virtually. It will be on a Zoom platform, and the link is available. The link was put out in a press release on the city's website for people to be able to tune in. A lot of times with boards and commissions, it's very much so about the work that happens within the body, but you all are welcoming the observation from the general public. You want the general public to tune in and to learn more about the work of ACAD. Can you talk about why it's so important for the general public to tune in, and what you hope could be even some possible outcomes of the general public learning about the work that ACAD is doing?
Krista, you want to take that one? Oh, she might be frozen. I'll say this, I like that because it presents some transparency that wouldn't exist without that. I like it also because if, you know, they have the ability to hear and observe and give us feedback. And again, when you have open it up like that, not only, of course, you're going to open it up to all kinds of feedback, but there's usually always something you can always learn from that feedback. Whether it's an idea, whether it's an improvement, you never know. It could be a network, a connection that can help us move and progress a strategy or an idea. And so I like the transparency and then the opportunities that that creates for other voices to be heard in the process. And that's important for our community. So everyone needs to feel like they are a part of something that's greater and that can can revolutionize how we are operating right now. So that's exciting to see that.
Crystal?
I think it's just as simple as we started as a grassroots and community-based idea, and that's the way that we should remain. And we should stay connected with the community, and I think that's what's going to keep us grounded. You know, a lot of times when we get in our small groups, we start to think like each other sometimes, and so we want to make sure that overall this decisions that are made and the paths that we go are community based, because I think that this group is representing the community. So we want to make sure that we're tapping into them, we're headed in the right directions. They are, you know, giving us feedback of what they think we should be looking into or how we're moving. I just think those things are important because that's where we started from. We started presenting ourselves as a grassroots community-based idea. And so this is formulated into a formal committee, but we don't want to lose sight of keeping that community touched in what we're doing.
Well, certainly as we wind down with 10 minutes left in the conversation, and we definitely have attendees that have been tuned in the entire time, I want to turn it back into and share the platform with our host, Rodney. Should there be any questions in the chat or even some additional questions, Rodney, that you're interested in having answered, but certainly want to extend a warm thank you and genuine appreciation to both Crystal and Josie for educating the community tonight on the existence of, the value of, and the focus of the Ad Hoc Committee on African American Disparity, also known as ACAD. Rodney?
Yeah, absolutely. And I remind folks, just type in your Q&A section. You can type your question in and we'll get it in the waning moments that we have here. But I did want to ask two two-part question, but they're not necessarily related. My wife is a midwife, so I've heard about healthcare disparities for quite some time. I'm a former teacher, so I'm well aware of disparities that we see in education, and then housing. I've heard about. In the time that you formed this committee, this task force, are there any other disparities that are not as well known that you could educate us about? That's to anyone.
Not as well known.
Or not as highlighted, not as people just aren't aware of that it might be a disparity that affects us as a community, but it's not publicized. I'm just wondering if there's something out there that's missing that you've come across in your work, something that needs to be highlighted more.
Well, just as staff support, we have heard much more conversation about infant mortality rate. And I think that, the community sometimes is unaware of the fact that Black populations have the highest rate of infant mortality or infant and or parental death by way of the mother during childbirth than any other population. And so speaking to the fact that your spouse is a midwife, it was definitely enlightening to hear that in the Housing and Health Disparity Subcommittee that would be part of the focus.
Okay. And secondly, my question would be, as you're moving forward, as you're growing, is there a group out there that some of our attendees may be able to assist with, or people that watch this later? Is there a group out there that you would like to collaborate with in the future? I'm thinking some church affiliations, some civic and social organizations. Or is anyone on the horizon that you have in your head? We need to target these folks.
I think that probably may be on an individual subcommittee basis. At this point, the subcommittees are doing their own individualized work. So it would be kind of hard. I know that there's the fair housing is happening Friday. So that's kind of something that they're in partnership with. So I think each group is kind of connecting in their own ways, depending on what particular disparities they're actually looking at and researching. I've heard about them making some connections out in the community, but specifically, I think it would be more dedicated to what they're working on at the time. But as far as partnerships, I'll let Love address that part. Not sure if we're ready for that yet.
Well, the way that any volunteer body works with the city, whether it's an existing board or commission, an ad hoc committee like the one being discussed tonight, or a task force, collaboration is always critical. But to Crystal's point, it is vital that the collaboration is based on the specificity of the need. So as all 5 groups begin to do their work, one of the things that is important to think about is, what does that particular organization, civic group, faith-based group, et cetera, what do they bring to the table by way of the ability to collaborate? Is it just the ability to have a platform to put information out there to captive audiences? And that's where sometimes your faith-based groups, et cetera, come into play. Sometimes it's a matter of themed work on behalf of sororities and fraternities across a year. Some of the things that they're working on or committed to touch on the things that this body or any other volunteer body would be focused on. Then there are times where it's important to bring service providers to the table in collaboration, because there are snippets of information, data that this group can glean from, that any volunteer body can glean from, because they're frontline service providers who are encountering populations on a regular basis where they're seeing trends unfold that they think would be relevant to a particular body, but vice versa. There are times when service providers look to volunteer bodies because the volunteer bodies have been able to engage the community, have some of the most contemporary conversations on a subject matter, and it educates the service provider in how to do their work and meet the needs of the patrons who come to their facility. So it's definitely bi-directional. It is work specific, but I have heard, the members of ACAD talk about the fact that at the point when they finish solidifying their work plan and the direction that they're going, that they would look to collaborate with different facets of the community.
Okay. And I got a question that was emailed to me earlier today, and this, Crystal, this is to you. With your work with communities and schools, and with us still in COVID-19, were there any problems that were exacerbated by COVID that you feel an immediate need to address? And they're specifically speaking about the digital divide, and especially in some of our Title I schools where we realized that they didn't have the technology-enriched devices, and these particular students of color or students that attend these Title I schools were negatively impacted by being away from face-to-face instruction.
I would say I am at the largest elementary school in the district, and one of the most underserved schools. And I can say that from my perspective, all of our students received devices. In the end, of course, in the beginning, no one was prepared for a pandemic. So we all kind of struggled and suffered to get those devices, and students who had devices at home had that advantage. But I will say that Guilford County Schools, as well as community partners, really worked and hustled to get devices to kids before we got out in June. And if it was not, I know that every student did not have a device, but every household had a device. And I being in the thick of things at that time, I think that we did the best that we could with getting this to underserved families. As far as the efforts that were taken, we were on school buses. We had bus drivers driving us around, and we were doing bus routes with laptops laid out on seats. There were just a lot of really grassroots efforts within our school communities that we did, and just kind of become very innovative in how we can reach our families. So, at this point, I can't say that we didn't really do everything that we could to try to reach the families. The barriers of quarantine and having to, have those spatial distances, and some families needing that social and emotional support, and lacking that, checked out. So, with me not being able, one thing that I do in my job, if I call you 2 times, I'm gonna come see you, because it's a reason why you're not answering me. And so sometimes they need that knock on the door of somebody to say, hey, I'm here to help you. And so that was taken away from me, that ability to be able to do those things. But as far as what could be done in the middle of a pandemic, I really feel like that all efforts were made to serve underserved communities the best that we could within the school system. I actually was very pleased by the efforts that were made. With the in and out of school and remote and face-to-face, a lot of that was out of our control. Those were, decisions made by the governor. So we had to kind of react and move as decisions were made. But as far as our underserved communities, having all efforts given to be able to make sure that they had, I really think that we did a pretty good job at doing that.
Well, ladies, my hat's off to you. You've given us a lot of good information. And as I mentioned before, this is going to be archived on our YouTube channel. So our viewers, if you know people that couldn't attend tonight, or if you just want to watch it again yourself, you can go to our YouTube channel. And, we still work with a lot of schools, and we turn a lot of these conversations into little units within a lesson plan. And so I can see where this can be helpful as well. So for Ms. Josie Williams and Crystal Black, and of course, Dr. Love Jones, Thank you for all the work you're doing. Thank you for starting. I know you got other things, you got other hats that you wear, but yet you're taking this one on as well. So you're doing good work, and you're going to benefit from it. But the museum certainly thanks you all. And we remind that we're going to close out the series next week. Are you tired yet, Dr. Jones?
Nope, not tired yet.
We got another one next week, Tuesday at 6 o'clock. That's on the 27th. From the Grassroots to Government series, it's Transgender Task Force. So tune in. You got to register. Everything we do is free, but you must register to attend. So, ladies, thank you. We really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Have a great evening.
Good night.
Good night.